Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into a world of candle smoke, chanting voices, and the slow, creaky turn of iron gears. You're wrapped in a woolen robe that smells faintly of sheep and incense, and your bare feet shuffle over cold stone. The air is thick with silence. Not the soft, cozy kind, but a loaded, expectant quiet that belongs to a monastery before dawn. You've woken up not because of any gentle sunrise, but because something, somewhere, has begun to ring, a bell. Low and resonant, it cuts through the dark like a call to arms. If arms in this case meant sleepy prayers in Latin. You yawn, stretch, and wonder for a moment if time still exists. Welcome to the world of medieval monks, where the day begins hours before the sun does. And where sleep is more suggestion than right, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you falling asleep in Thailand or winding down in Texas? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly through the cloister, past the flicker of candlelight. The stone walls are damp, ancient, and slightly mossy, like the inside of a cool cave someone forgot to seal. You're surrounded by other robed figures who look just as confused to be awake. Some are squinting. One might be sleepwalking. All of you are headed to the chapel, summoned by that relentless, echoing bell. In the 9th century, this was normal. Monks lived by the rule of Saint Benedict, which meant prayers had to happen at specific times. These weren't your typical morning or night prayers either, they happened 7 times a day, with the first, matins, sometimes beginning as early as 2:30 a.m. That's right. In a world without TikTok or espresso, these guys willingly woke up before roosters just to chant in the dark. And no, they didn't have alarm clocks, at least, not yet. Early monasteries relied on a curious mix of trust and ambient guesswork. There was usually one designated monk, the sacristan or timekeeper, whose job it was to feel when it was time. Imagine that responsibility. If you oversleep, the entire monastery misses prayer and the day unravels. No pressure, you trudge into the chapel now. The room is echoey and cold, with stone benches and flickering torches. There's a faint scent of beeswax and something herbal, probably a monk's attempt at incense or deodorant. Everyone settles into their places and begins to chant. It's low and droning, the kind of sound that could either lull you back to sleep or summon a minor saint. And here's the twist, while modern people often think monks had quiet, peaceful lives, the reality is that their days were rigidly chopped into segments. Waking up this early was just the first slice. After this prayer service, you'd get maybe a short nap before the next bell. Then more prayers. Then readings. Then work. Then prayers again. It was a life of deep devotion. And serious sleep deprivation, one mainstream fact, the rule of Saint Benedict, written around the year 516, set this structured rhythm in motion. It outlined exact times for everything, when to wake, pray, eat, work, and even how much wine you could drink. Spoiler, not much, unless you were sick. The goal was to create a godly routine, stable, predictable, and spiritually nourishing, but this same routine created a challenge. How do you wake up at 2:30 a.m. every night without fail? How do you know it's time without looking at your phone or glancing at a digital display? Well, one fringe tidbit, some monasteries trained their sacristans to track the stars. These monks would sit outside at night, watching specific constellations rise and fall. If Orion's belt hit the right spot on the horizon, time to ring the bell. This made cloudy nights an existential crisis. Of course, not all methods were so poetic. Some monasteries used water clocks, a kind of primitive timer where water dripped from one vessel into another, and when the lower bowl filled to a certain line, it was time. Problem is, those clocks didn't work in freezing weather. And sometimes rats drank from them, but perhaps the most human method, also the most unreliable, was assigning wake-up duty to the lightest sleeper. This person would be given a small bell or pebble to throw at other monks' doors. Effective? Occasionally. Popular? Not at all. Woe to the guy who had to be the pebble thrower during Lent. Historians still argue whether these natural alarms were genuinely effective or if monks just lived in a constant state of spiritual panic. Some scholars believe that the chaos of this preclock system actually inspired the need for mechanical timekeeping. Others argue it was merely about pride. Monasteries liked big bells, and even bigger gear systems, but tonight, you're just a sleepy monk, trying to stay awake while someone chants about sin in a language you barely remember from your novitiate. The candle beside you flickers. The chill in the air seeps into your bones. Someone nearby sneezes. You wonder, could you just not wake up next time? But no, you can't. The rhythm of prayer and time pulls you forward like a tide. The bell, whether real or imagined, is coming again. And so, you lower your head, murmur your part of the chant, and wait for the dawn, or the next bell, whichever comes first. You barely remember returning to your straw-stuffed mattress. Maybe you never left the chapel at all. Everything between matins and the next service is a fog of cold stone and half-sleep. But now, as another bell echoes through the cloisters, higher pitched this time, you groan, roll over, and pull your robe tighter around your shoulders. It's time again. This is the tyranny of the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the early 6th century by a Roman noble-turned-monk. The rule was supposed to be a gentle guide to spiritual living. And in many ways, it was. Benedict encouraged moderation, humility, and shared labor. But his approach to time? Unforgiving. He believed the entire day should be structured like a sacred poem, divided evenly, repeated daily, and obeyed precisely. The word routine doesn't even come close. You shuffle past the refectory, where breakfast will not be served for hours, and into a small stone room where several bleary-eyed monks sit nodding. This is the chapter house, where daily readings are performed and mild confessions are made. A monk to your left has clearly fallen asleep. No one wakes him. You understand, the rule of Benedict divided each day into 8 canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These weren't equal in duration, nor were they strictly tied to modern hours. Instead, they responded to light. The first prayer might be in the dead of night, while others were slotted around the rising and setting of the sun. This meant summer days were long, full of work and sunshine. And winter days were short, but somehow still exhausting. The concept was beautiful, in theory. The sacred infused every moment. But in practice, it was relentless. You'd barely finish one prayer session before another bell summoned you like a divine school bell. Even meals were timed down to the minute, with readings performed during eating, because talking was discouraged, if not outright banned. A mainstream historical fact here: Benedict's rule became the foundation for most Western monastic life. By the 9th century, it was the standard across Europe, especially under Charlemagne's reforms. Monasteries that followed it were seen as more disciplined, more pious, and more productive. Which also meant, more predictable. More bell rings. More bleary-eyed monks. One fringe tidbit. Some monasteries added extra, unofficial prayer times for particularly devoted monks who wanted to show off. Known as private devotions, these were encouraged but not required. Still, the pressure to perform spiritually sometimes turned prayer into a competition. Imagine it: Brother Gerhard is up before everyone else, again, just to whisper a few bonus psalms. You respect it. You also kind of resent it. There's another awkward fact that no one really mentions out loud in the scriptorium, but you all know it: the rule never really accounted for weather. Or illness. Or, well, sleep. The schedule simply carried on. If the wind blew your candle out, too bad. If you had a fever, that was God's test. If it snowed and you couldn't hear the bell, that was your fault. Monastic time didn't pause for comfort. You pass Brother Odo in the corridor. He's the timekeeper today, a role rotated weekly. Poor guy. His eyelids look like they're made of lead. His job is to anticipate the next hour, ring the bell exactly on cue, and double-check that everyone shows up. If he misses even one service, it goes in the record book, and, depending on the monastery, he might be assigned extra dish duty or have to copy psalms for 3 hours without complaint. He will definitely complain. Historians still argue whether the rule was truly meant to be so inflexible. Some scholars suggest Benedict wrote it more as a suggestion, open to local interpretation. Others argue that later abbots took it too literally, turning what was meant as spiritual guidance into a rigid daily script. Either way, by the time you're living it here in the 11th century, it feels more like a divine clock than a flexible rhythm, and yet there's a strange piece to it all. As you sit in the choir stall for lauds, your mind starts to float. The chants rise like steam. The rhythm of sung Latin settles into your chest. There are no choices to make, no emails to answer, no cities to drive through. Just bells. Psalms. Bells again. The day shapes you, instead of you shaping it, and that is the deeper intention behind Benedict's rule. It removes ego, replaces it with structure, and places your spiritual life at the center. Even if that center happens to be at 3:45 in the morning, you stand for the closing prayer, stretch your arms behind your back, and feel your joints complain. The monk beside you scratches his beard, which sounds oddly loud in the acoustics of the chapel. Someone coughs, then coughs again. You make eye contact, and for a second, both of you are trying not to laugh. It passes. As you file out, another monk is already checking the position of the sun, or what little light filters through the high window. He's estimating the start of prime, the next prayer hour. That's when the chores begin. But for now, there's a small pocket of time, a sliver of stillness between bells. You head to the cloister garden, hoping to walk in circles for a few minutes before being summoned again. The air smells of damp herbs and distant smoke. You hear a faint chime in the distance, someone testing a smaller bell. Or maybe time's just passing. Hard to say anymore, the tyranny of time. You're starting to get used to it. The sun, at last, is beginning to peek through the gray haze of morning. It's not exactly rising so much as it is diffusing, soft and reluctant, over the cloister walls. You squint up at the pale sky, unsure whether you're actually seeing light or if your sleep-deprived brain is just inventing it. Another bell tolls. This one is for prime, the first official prayer of the day, if you don't count the ones that started before any sane person was awake. You sigh and pull your hood up over your head. The cold has settled into your bones, and you can already feel a yawn brewing like bad soup. No matter. Time waits for no monk. Today, prime begins with a short reading from the Psalter, followed by a brief exhortation from the prior about, what was it again, humility. Or possibly cheese theft. Your thoughts drift. The rhythm of monastic life has a lulling effect. You begin to count the syllables of the chant instead of the words. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, eventually, the service ends, and now comes something both dreaded and oddly fascinating, the daily tasks. Here's where the problem really starts. How do you organize a monastery's entire routine, labor, prayers, meals, if your idea of an hour keeps changing? See, unlike modern timekeeping, medieval monks didn't work with 60-minute blocks. They divided daylight into 12 hours, and darkness into another 12. Which means an hour in summer might be 75 minutes long. But in winter, it shrinks to 45. Confusing? Yes. Especially if you're the monk in charge of the soup. You step into the kitchens briefly, inhaling the sharp scent of onions and lentils simmering over a wood fire. A sleepy novice is watching the pot. You both exchange exhausted nods. It's not breakfast yet. It's never breakfast yet. Back in the garden, you find Brother Anselm crouched beside the sundial. He's frowning at it like it owes him money. The problem is, of course, that the sun's not cooperating. In overcast weather, which is roughly always in 12th century England, sundials are more symbolic than useful. This is the ongoing struggle, monastic time versus solar time. a mainstream historical fact here. Before the rise of mechanical clocks in the 13th and 14th centuries, most monastic communities relied on natural cues. Sundials during the day, the stars at night, and internal rhythms in between. That sounds peaceful, almost romantic, but in reality, it meant constant improvisation. You couldn't just check the time. You had to guess, estimate, and hope nobody called you out for ringing the bell too early, a fringe tidbit. In some monasteries, they installed liturgical sundials on the outside of the chapel walls. These were specialized stone carvings, not marked with traditional hour lines, but instead labeled with canonical prayer times. So instead of 8 a.m., you'd see terce begins when the shadow touches the tail of the fish. Elegant. Confusing. Very monkcore. You and Brother Anselm examine the stone carving together. A thin stick in the center casts a shadow, but it's faint, probably indicating nothing. He shrugs, rings the handbell anyway, and hopes no one notices that he's guessing. Spoiler, they'll all guess too. Historians still argue whether this flexible, sun-based timekeeping created spiritual mindfulness or just logistical headaches. One school of thought suggests that by aligning prayer with the rhythms of the natural world, monks stayed closer to God's creation. Another suggests that the lack of precision led to chaos, arguments, and the eventual invention of, well, alarm clocks, which you can see coming, by the way. That ticking monster is somewhere in the future. But for now, you live in the liminal space between guesstimates and bells. The chores begin. You're assigned to the scriptorium today, which is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, you get to sit indoors and copy Latin texts. On the other, you have to copy Latin texts. All morning. In silence. With a quill that sheds like a nervous chicken, the scriptorium is narrow, with thick glass windows that let in just enough light to make you squint but not enough to help you see clearly. Brother Martin is already there, hunched over his parchment. He's been copying job for 3 weeks. His eyes twitch, you settle in and begin writing. In principio crevit Deus. You pause. Is that a smudge or a blot? You blink hard. Your hand cramps after 5 lines, monastic time doesn't care. After what feels like several eternities, real or imagined, you hear another bell. Terce. Time to stop, stretch your back, and shuffle to the next service. You can't help but feel that the day has barely begun, and yet it's already sliced into too many pieces. Your sense of time is being slowly, gently sanded away. You remember what a visiting abbot once said over a very solemn lunch: in a monastery, one does not live by hours. One lives by obedience. You nodded at the time. Now you're starting to think he just hated watches. As you file into the chapel once again, the sun has finally committed to showing up. Light pools through the stained glass, painting red and gold on the floor. The bell still echoes faintly outside, a reminder that even in the presence of beauty, you are always being timed. You chant. You breathe. You wonder what time it is. You realize it doesn't matter. The bells will tell you. The chapel empties slowly, robes swishing like soft waves over stone. You step out into the mid-morning air, which carries the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and faintly burnt porridge. You're barely awake, yet already several hours into your day. And now comes the truly strange part: no one has a watch. Not even an hourglass. And yet, every monk around you knows exactly where to be, and when, well. Almost exactly. Before mechanical clocks arrived, waking up in a monastery was an act of divine trust, or divine misjudgment. In the absence of tick-tocks and alarms, monks relied on some of the most inconsistent methods imaginable. Tonight, we step into the curious world of waking without an alarm. You make your way to the infirmary garden, where Brother Sylvanus tends to medicinal herbs and argues gently with bees. He waves you over and offers a sprig of mint, which you tuck into your robe out of politeness. As he works, he tells you a story about his early days as the sacristan, the monk responsible for rousing everyone for matins. Apparently, they used to assign the job to whoever had the best natural sense of time. Sylvanus, it turns out, was terrible at it. One morning he rang the bell an hour early. The monks chanted matins while bats still wheeled overhead. Another time, he overslept entirely, and the abbot had to bang a ladle against the chapel door to wake the community. You laugh politely. He does not. One mainstream historical fact: prior to the widespread use of mechanical clocks, around the 14th century, the most advanced timekeeping methods included water clocks, candle clocks, and, believe it or not, trained humans. Water clocks, or clepsydry, were used in some wealthier monasteries. Water would drip slowly from one container into another, calibrated to take a known amount of time to fill. A floating marker would rise with the water, showing roughly how much time had passed. Sounds elegant, until it freezes in the winter. Or overflows. Or gets mysteriously knocked over by a curious cat. Yes, monasteries had cats. Candle clocks were more inventive. A tall, thick candle marked with hourly intervals would burn slowly, indicating time by the depth of melted wax. Some candles had embedded nails that fell onto a metal plate once the wax melted, making a small clink to wake the sacristan. Ingenious. But they only worked if lit. And if someone forgot to light the candle? Well. Silence. You walk past one of these candle clocks now, sitting half-melted in a niche near the kitchen. Someone's tried to mark it with charcoal lines, but the wax has slumped sadly to one side, like it gave up trying to be useful. Then there were the monks themselves, their own bodies as clocks. After years of living under the rule, many monks developed uncanny internal rhythms. They could feel when 2 or 3 hours had passed. Some reportedly woke up within 5 minutes of matins without fail. You suspect this has more to do with chronic sleep deprivation than divine intuition, but still, impressive. One fringe tidbit. Some abbeys had a monk whose sole job was to stay awake all night, reading psalms by candlelight until it was time to ring the bell. He was called a vigilant brother or, less formally, that poor guy. In one particularly cold monastery in the Alps, he was reportedly allowed a cup of warm beer at midnight just to keep him alive until morning. This poor soul would trudge through the freezing cloisters, tapping on doors or shaking the ropes of handbells hung inside cells. If you didn't answer, he'd open the door and toss a damp rag at your face. Or worse, sing loudly off-key until you begged for mercy. Historians still argue whether these methods were consistent or chaos. Some suggest that most monks were too exhausted to notice if matins was a few minutes late. Others believe that abbots were deeply obsessed with punctuality, as a sign of obedience, and therefore punished even minor lateness. The truth, as usual, probably varies wildly by region, era, and how grumpy the abbot was that morning. You shuffle along the corridor and spot the wake-up window, a narrow slit in the eastern wall designed to let in the very first light of dawn. In theory, the sun hitting this opening signaled the start of the day. In practice, it meant monks kept checking it like a medieval version of glancing at your phone at 5 a.m. and muttering, "Ugh. Too early." You pause for a moment. The breeze through the cloister carries the faint clank of tools and soft chanting. Terce is still echoing somewhere behind you. You lean against a column, close your eyes, and try to imagine what life would feel like without this endless ticking structure. Just rising with the sun, eating when you're hungry, sleeping until your body says enough. A sudden loud clang startles you. It's a handbell from across the courtyard. Someone's knocked over a bucket. No emergency. Just another reminder that noise is the only alarm system you've got. You make your way to the chapel once more for the midday service, known as sext. The sun is fully up now, though you've barely eaten and feel like you've lived 3 days in the last 6 hours. As you kneel and chant again, you notice someone 2 seats over discreetly nodding off. You admire his form, head tilted just so, hands still folded. Impressive technique. And in your own head, the thought forms again, surely there must be a better way to keep time. Something that rings when it's supposed to. Something you can count on, but that innovation hasn't arrived yet. For now, you wake by candle, by water, by whisper, by instinct. And most of all, by bell. The bell rings again, deep and deliberate, and you feel it in your chest more than your ears. It's time for sext, the midday prayer that marks, quite inconveniently, the moment when you most want a nap. Instead, you haul yourself up, your knees cracking in protest, and shuffle back into the dim chapel with the other monks, each of you swaying slightly like crops in a tired wind, but something's different this time. As you settle onto your wooden bench, you catch sight of a strange metal shape in the corner of the chapel, a tower of wheels, gears, and rope. It creaks. It ticks. It has a bell at the top that no one dares touch. This, you realize, is it. The future. The problem. The machine that's about to ruin your only excuse for oversleeping, the mechanical clock. A mainstream historical fact, mechanical clocks began appearing in monastic settings as early as the late 13th century. The earliest examples were massive devices with iron gears and no faces, just a system of moving weights and levers designed to ring a bell at regular intervals. They had no hands, no dials, and zero subtlety. But they had one job, and they did it: they made noise. On time. Every time, unfortunately, that time was often wrong. You step closer during the prayer's closing chant to examine the device. A large weight dangles on a rope, slowly unwinding as it powers a drum of gears. There's a wooden beam being pushed by a turning wheel. It all looks like it's just on the verge of collapsing. And yet, miraculously, it works. Monks across Europe began installing these clocks in bell towers not because they wanted to impress the neighbors, but because of pure exhaustion. No more guessing the stars. No more watching the sun's shadow crawl across the chapel wall. Just a bell, triggered by a machine, announcing when you had to stop what you were doing and go pray. Again, and for many monks, this was a nightmare. You stand there watching the gears turn and feel a subtle, gnawing irritation. Because unlike a sleepy sacristan or a cloudy sky, this machine doesn't forget. It doesn't feel guilty about waking you up. It doesn't care that your knees hurt or that Brother Jerome keeps falling asleep during Vespers and snoring like a plow horse. One fringe tidbit: the first mechanical clocks didn't ring on the hour. They rang every 15 minutes. That means you could be in the garden, finally meditating in silence with the bees and your own thoughts, and clang. 15 minutes gone. Meditate faster. You imagine the poor monk assigned to maintain the thing. It's probably Brother Oswin. He's always covered in soot and muttering about gear alignment. He has to climb into the tower every night to rewind the clock, adjusting ropes and weights and hoping a bird hasn't nested inside the mechanism. Once, the bell didn't ring at all, and Oswin spent 3 days transcribing psalms as penance. In Latin. With a goose feather, historians still argue whether these early mechanical clocks were accurate enough to rely on. Some claim they were marvels of engineering, with precision that rivaled even later timepieces. Others suggest they were mostly symbolic, monuments to the idea of discipline rather than its practical application. What's certain is that monks began to reorganize their days around these machines, whether they liked it or not. And many of them did not like it. You walk through the cloister garden, the ticking sound of the clock tower following you like an annoying bird. It's loud, insistent, mechanical. Before, there was mystery in the time. You could feel it in your bones or guess it from the color of the sky. Now, time has a sound, and that sound is clunk 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 ding. You pass by Brother Crispin, who is tending the cabbage beds and muttering angrily about the new devil gear. He claims it rings earlier every day, though you're pretty sure it's just because he's getting older and more irritable. Still, you can't help but agree, it's unnatural. Cold. It doesn't hum like a candle or flow like water. It snaps and jerks and makes you feel like you're living in the inside of a kettle drum. To make things worse, the mechanical clock doesn't take naps. It doesn't slow down when it rains. It doesn't forgive. And monks, used to a life of rhythm and grace, are now being jerked from sleep by a shrill, unrelenting bell that has no soul. You head back inside for a bit of rest. If it can even be called that. As you settle onto your cot, the walls still reverberating faintly from the last chime, you wonder, were things better before the machine? Back when a star told you when to rise, and a sleepy sacristan decided whether it was really worth ringing the bell, maybe not. But it felt gentler. The weight of time now feels heavier, measured, carved, and shouted from an iron tower. It's no longer a whisper or a gentle poke from Brother Sylvanus. It's an industrial yell. Still, as the clock ticks above you, turning gears you don't understand, you drift off to the rhythm of a new kind of timekeeping. One that doesn't sleep, doesn't bend, and definitely doesn't care if your dream was just getting interesting. You don't wake up so much as get dragged awake by the next bell. It doesn't matter that you were in the middle of a rather serene dream about floating down a river of lentil stew. The machine has spoken. You sit up slowly, joints aching, blanket half tangled around your legs, and wonder, not for the first time, who in their right mind thought it would be a good idea to assign one monk the job of rewinding this infernal device every single night. Meet the most sleep-deprived man in the monastery. The clockwinder, the mechanical clock, for all its medieval majesty, is not self-sustaining. It runs on weights, massive, heavy blocks of stone or metal suspended from long ropes. As gravity pulls them down, they turn a series of gears, which ultimately move the bell striker. But once those weights reach the bottom of their ropes, the clock stops dead. So, naturally, someone has to climb up and crank them back into place. Every single day, you shuffle out of your cell and spot Brother Oswin, the monastery's long-suffering horologist, stumbling back from the bell tower. His hair looks like it lost a fight with a bird, and he's got soot on his nose again. He nods at you, bleary-eyed, and mumbles something about gear lash. You don't ask. He doesn't want to talk. He just wants a nap. A mainstream historical fact: medieval mechanical clocks had to be wound daily, or, in some cases, twice daily, depending on the length of the ropes and the weight system design. The winding mechanism was often located in the bell tower, which meant an exhausting climb up a spiral staircase, often in the dark, often in the cold, while carrying tools, oil, and a healthy amount of frustration. The job usually fell to a junior monk, or to someone with mechanical aptitude and poor luck. Being assigned clock duty was often considered a form of spiritual character building. In reality, it was a punishment dressed in gears. You follow Oswin's path up the spiral stairs, just to see for yourself. The stone steps are worn smooth in the middle, and there's a slight draft that smells like dust and bird feathers. At the top, you find the machine, a large wooden frame crammed with iron gears, pulleys, and a great vertical drum wound with rope. The weights are monstrous, 2 of them, each the size of a small barrel. Oswin has just finished cranking them up by hand with a massive iron winch. His palms are blistered. His robes are smudged with grease. He wipes his face with a sleeve and mutters something under his breath that you're fairly sure is not Latin. One fringe tidbit. In some monasteries, the clockwinder got special permission to skip certain prayer services on days when he was on tower duty. This was seen as a generous concession. It was, in fact, a small mercy. Other times, monks would take turns winding the clock in pairs, one to turn the crank, and the other to recite psalms or keep watch for accidental injuries. Falling weights were not uncommon. Neither were jammed gears. The machine had all the charm of a lion on a leash, majestic, but temperamental. You run your fingers along the edge of one gear. The teeth are uneven, crudely filed. The whole thing looks like it was built by someone who'd never seen a gear before, but was told what one ought to do. And yet, somehow, it works. Historians still argue whether early mechanical clocks improved monastic life or merely shifted the burden from spiritual stress to mechanical maintenance. Some suggest that the regularity offered monks a more reliable prayer rhythm. Others say it made them resentful, trading the uncertainties of nature for the cold tyranny of an iron schedule. Oswin grabs a small vial of oil and begins dabbing it along the axle joints. He explains, half to himself, that if the gears dry out, the bell striker will seize again, like last Thursday. You wouldn't believe how loud a stuck gear sounds at 3 a.m., he says. You believe him. Down below, the rest of the monastery is waking, again. You hear doors creak, sandals scuff on stone, voices murmur half-formed prayers. The machine has done its job. No delays. No mercy, you descend the tower slowly, footsteps echoing around the narrow stone shaft. Part of you is in awe. This mechanical marvel is centuries ahead of its time, a product of ingenuity and patience. But part of you, perhaps the larger part, just wants to go back to letting the sacristan throw a beanbag at your door when it was time to get up. There was a humanity to it. A softness. You pass Brother Oswin once more on your way down. He's sitting on a low bench, head in his hands, quietly reciting Compline to himself even though it's not evening yet. Clock winding, it seems, is not just physical labor, it's spiritual erosion. Back in the refectory, a few monks sip warm broth in silence. The bell will ring again soon. It always does. And someone, somewhere, will have to climb back up those stairs and rewind time. Literally, you wrap your fingers around your cup, feel the steam rise into your face, and wonder if anyone's considered just letting the weights hit bottom. What happens then? Does the world stop spinning? Do the prayers fall silent? Or do you all, quietly, fall asleep, but then you hear it again, clunk, clunk, clang, time marches on. Pulled up by ropes. Carried on blistered hands. You shuffle from the refectory back out into the courtyard, your steps unconsciously falling into rhythm with the ticking echo that seems to come from every corner of the monastery now. Even when the clock isn't chiming, you feel it, like the slow, relentless heartbeat of a building that's more machine than stone. It wasn't always like this. You pass by the old bell rope near the cloister, now dusty and sagging. No one uses it anymore. Not since the clock took over. Back when the sacristan rang that rope manually, there was a kind of personality to it. Some bells were slow and apologetic. Others, especially when Brother Edric was annoyed, were short and sharp, like a shout. The bell had moods back then. Now it's a rhythm. Not a voice, but it wasn't just sleep schedules and sacred timing that this new invention changed. It redefined how monks thought about time itself. One mainstream historical fact: before the spread of mechanical clocks, time in the medieval world was largely event-based rather than numerical. People thought in terms like sunrise, before the bell, or after supper, rather than 3:15 p.m. Time was a sequence of natural and social cues, not a rigid set of hourly units marching forward on a dial. The clock shattered that. Suddenly, monks had to learn to count time in ways that had never mattered before. Minutes. Quarters. Halves. Precision that didn't just apply to prayer anymore, but to work. Meals, sleep, copying texts, even the time between confessions. Brother Ethelbald, the abbot's assistant, now carries a set of wooden tablets where he records things like Brother Godric arrived 8 minutes late to prime and the garden crew exceeded their allotment by 12 minutes. You once watched him scold a kitchen monk for beginning lentil soaking prematurely. There are now rules for soaking. What a time to be alive. And this is where the real tension creeps in. Because even in a monastery, perhaps especially in a monastery, there's always a struggle between sacred time and scheduled time. You pause under the cloister arch and look up. The clock ticks above. The sun shines below. Two timekeepers, at odds. Sacred time is fluid. Flexible. Rooted in tradition, nature, and the rhythm of the divine office. You pray when the light changes. You eat when the bell rings. You sleep when the psalms allow, but scheduled time. That's a list. A grid. A series of slots that get filled in, whether you're ready or not. One fringe tidbit: some monasteries began painting time wheels onto their walls in the 14th century, circular diagrams showing the entire day divided into color-coded slices, prayers in blue, meals in brown, work in red. They looked like spiritual pie charts, meant to help novices learn the daily rhythm. But to some older monks, they were unsettling, symbols that time had gone from a flow to a plan. Historians still argue whether this shift in thinking was for better or worse. Some say it made monasteries more efficient and better stewards of their labor. Others argue it led to spiritual burnout, as monks began to chase bells instead of listening for grace. One abbot in northern France famously smashed his own clock, calling it a noisy pagan oracle. He was later voted least popular man at synod. You continue walking through the scriptorium, where monks now write not just holy texts, but time logs. Brother Marcus is sketching tiny Roman numerals along the edge of his parchment, trying to estimate how many psalms can be copied in an hour. He says it helps him stay focused. You suspect he just wants an excuse to draw more numerals. You sit beside him briefly and stare at your own blank page. The ticking clock tower booms faintly above. You glance up. Back down. Time is now measured, yes, but it is also watched. Observed. Expected, and that changes things. Once upon a time, a prayer service might start a few minutes late because Brother John was finishing feeding the chickens. Now, if the prayer begins 30 seconds off schedule, there's a note in the abbot's ledger. You begin to write, in principio erat verbum. And pause. There's a hum beneath your ribcage. You're aware, painfully aware, of the seconds ticking away, and that awareness doesn't just live here. It spreads into every thought, every action. A constant undercurrent. Is this taking too long? Should I move faster? Am I wasting time? The monks don't say it aloud, of course. But you all feel it. Even the prayers have become metered, even the silence has a clock inside it. Later, during none, the mid-afternoon prayer, you kneel and listen as the last notes of the chant echo off the vaulted ceiling. You close your eyes. You try to feel the old rhythm, the spiritual breath of the place. But there it is again. The creak of the gear. The tick. The not quite quiet of a monastery now divided between obedience to God and obedience to an iron will. You return to your cell as the light begins to mellow. You sit. You breathe. You listen to your own heartbeat and wonder, just for a moment, if the bell will ring early again. Or if the clock, for once, will give you a minute back. It never does. The bell for Vespers tolls low and long, a kind of sigh through the bones of the monastery. Evening is settling across the cloisters like a thick wool blanket, soft, scratchy, and unmistakably heavy. You rise from your bench, not because you're ready, but because readiness stopped mattering several bells ago. This is how the day dies now, not in a gentle fade, but in measured intervals, each one echoed by the clock tower that refuses to forget. You walk the corridor toward the chapel, passing Brother Benedict, who's balancing a stack of hymnals with the concentration of a man holding a tower of bread. He nods to you. You nod back. Neither of you speak. Words are a luxury when your ears are still ringing from the last chime. Vespers is the most beautiful service of the day, or at least, that's what the abbey says. A slow, golden liturgy meant to wind the spirit down, soften the world's edges, and invite reflection. But tonight, it begins with an awkward delay. The bell chimes too soon, and half the monks arrive still chewing their evening bread. You glance up at the mechanical clock's alcove and swear you see one of its gears twitch in smug satisfaction, a mainstream historical fact. As clocks became more prevalent in monasteries, they gradually shifted not only when prayers happened, but how those prayers were structured. Chants began ending with greater precision. Readings were trimmed to fit standard time blocks. Even homilies were sometimes shortened or cut entirely to keep to the schedule. You can feel that shift here now. Vespers used to be fluid, spontaneous even. A psalm extended if the chant was particularly lovely. A silence held longer if the light through the window looked just right. But now, if Brother Aord's final verse runs more than 30 seconds over, the sacristan gives him a look. A clock look. You try to focus as the chant begins. The harmonies, soft and deliberate, rise into the arches like incense. You close your eyes, let your breathing match the rhythm. But it's not quite natural. The pace is a fraction faster than usual, hurried by some invisible sense that there is a countdown ticking just above your heads, a fringe tidbit, some monasteries that adopted mechanical clocks developed internal rivalries between traditionalists and clock monks. The latter group took pride in punctuality, precision, and efficiency, sometimes to the point of obsession. The former resisted these changes, arguing that prayer should flow from the heart, not a gear system. One abbey reportedly had to reassign half its monks after a heated argument over whether lauds should start at 4:02 or 4 o'clock exactly. Historians still argue whether the clock created a deeper discipline or merely disguised anxiety in spiritual robes. Some say the fixed schedule led to greater collective unity, everyone truly praying in unison. Others argue it imposed an artificial order, replacing sacred contemplation with synchronized compliance. You can't decide, the music shifts into the Magnificat. You sing the Latin words from memory, anima mea dominum dat, and feel their echo in your chest. This part never changes. The words are older than any bell, any rope, any wheel. You try to hold on to that comfort, but then, the final note ends, and you count the beats before the next chime, 1, 2, 3. There it is. Like a leash, you exit the chapel with the others, robes brushing along the floor in a low whisper of wool. Evening light spills through the cloisters, red and gold and fading fast. You watch the shadows lengthen on the wall, your own stretched thin beside you. Time used to be something you watched. Now it watches you. In the refectory, the meal is quiet, as always. A monk reads aloud from a small volume of saints' lives. You catch a few lines about a desert hermit who once fasted for 40 days and was miraculously fed by ravens. You wonder, vaguely, whether ravens are easier to train than a clock. Probably. You finish your bread and cabbage stew, then scrub your bowl clean in the cold stone sink, all while the clock ticks just above your shoulder. It is never not ticking. You wonder if you'll one day hear it even in your dreams. Back in your cell, you sit on the narrow bed and pull your knees to your chest. Your body aches in the way only monastic routines can produce, a stiffness of repetition. The candle flickers. You've got a few minutes before Compline, the final prayer of the day. You reach for your psalter, but pause. Instead, you listen. Outside, the wind nudges the trees. A bird makes a sleepy sound from the roof beam. Somewhere in the corridor, a sandal scuffs, followed by a stifled sneeze. And then, silence. Brief. Almost holy, and there it is, the old rhythm. Just for a breath. The pulse of a day ending, not counted by gears or dials or chiming brass, but by light, by silence, by the cooling air on stone. Then the clock ticks again. Just once. Loud. Final, the moment ends. You stand, straighten your robe, and head to Compline. The day is not yours to end. That's the clock's job now. The chapel is dim for Compline, lit only by a few flickering candles and the pale blue hush of twilight pressing in through narrow windows. It feels like the monastery is finally exhaling. The day, so precisely measured, so insistently sectioned, is drawing to a close, and for once, there is no rush to meet the next bell. This is the final one. For now, you kneel with the others, shoulders touching in a line of bowed heads and heavy wool. The chant begins. Soft, slow, intentional. This is the hour of surrender, when the rule of Saint Benedict calls for complete silence until dawn. You recite the ancient words with quiet reverence, your voice folding into the warmth of the community's final breath for the day. And yet, even now, you're aware of it, the machine is still ticking, somewhere above your head, behind stone and timber and gears, it wins on. Even when you sleep, it won't. It can't. The clock has become the monastery's sleepless monk, its most devoted, most obsessive, and most resented brother. After the final amen, the monks rise in silence, filing out into the hallway like shadows. No one speaks. That's the rule now. You pad down the corridor back to your cell, trying not to let your sandals slap the stone. The candles sputter as you pass. You open the door to your cell and enter the small square of peace you've been granted. A cot. A shelf. A candle stub. A salter. A single wool blanket that has not, in centuries, been described as comfortable. You settle in and lie back. The straw mattress prickles your shoulder blades. You close your eyes. The silence wraps around you. Tick, there it is again, tick, the clock tower, the mechanical monk, is keeping vigil. It always does. A mainstream historical fact, the integration of clocks into monastic life didn't end with bells and prayers. Over time, monastic communities became the custodians of timekeeping for entire regions. Their clocks regulated markets, festivals, and town schedules. What began as an internal tool for prayer became a public utility, and monks, in turn, became the quiet timekeepers of medieval Europe, and that came with power. Your abbey, for example, is now the reference point for nearby farms. The bell that rings for lauds also tells the shepherd when to bring in his flock. The bell for sext reminds villagers to take a break from the fields. You, wrapped in your robe and wondering whether the ticking will ever fade, have unwittingly become part of a much larger mechanism. One fringe tidbit: at least one medieval monastery employed an official bell adjuster, a monk whose only job was to tweak the mechanical timing to match natural cues, like the sun's position or the call of the first nightingale. His unofficial nickname? Brother Almost. Because the bells were almost right, you smile at the memory. Brother Almost eventually left the monastery, it said, to live in the woods and avoid all sounds resembling gears. You respect that. Historians still argue whether the spread of mechanical time from monasteries into the secular world was a blessing or a burden. Some point to improved harvests, better labor organization, even the seeds of scientific precision. Others see the moment as the beginning of time as tyranny, a shift from sacred rhythms to rigid expectations. You're not sure where you stand, you only know what it feels like, lying here, eyes closed, bones aching, spirit full and tired and empty all at once. Tick, another moment gone. You think about the monks who came before the clock. Those who waited for the stars, who relied on instinct and shadows and the subtle creak of the world turning. You wonder if they slept more deeply, or if they, too, were kept awake by worry, by routine, by the quiet anxiety that they might forget to wake the others. The candle at your bedside burns low. The flame dances on the stone wall, casting strange little saints and demons in silhouette. You let your breathing slow. Tick, you try to imagine a world without time, not without rhythm, but without units. No minutes. No hours. Just cycles. Sleep when tired. Pray when called. Eat when there is bread. Work until the shadows stretch long. And then stop. Would the spirit be freer, would you? But that world is gone now, or at least, hiding behind the machinery that insists on minutes and order and bells that ring whether you want them to or not. Still, something inside you resists. Quietly. Patiently. A part of you that hums not to the clock's beat, but to the slower, older cadence of wind and sky. You wrap your blanket tighter. The chapel bell is silent now. The stars are rising. And outside your window, the ticking continues, steady and sure, and yet, for all its insistence, the clock does not own you, it simply reminds you that time passes. Whether you're ready or not. Whether you're listening or not. Whether you're dreaming. Or still waiting for sleep to come. Sometime in the deep stillness between Compline and Matins, the darkest stretch of night when even the candles seem to sleep, you wake, not fully. Not suddenly, just enough to notice, the silence is absolute. Not a footstep. Not a murmur. The monastery breathes as one enormous sleeper, curled into itself under the cloak of moonlight. And in that hush, where you'd expect peace, something else rises. Tick, that ever-present sound, soft but inescapable. The mechanical monk is still awake. Still working. Still counting. You roll over on your straw mattress, blanket clutched up to your chin, and stare at the low wooden beams above. It's cold. Your toes curl instinctively. The urge to drift back into sleep competes with a stubborn curiosity. How did it come to this? How did a place meant to lift the soul end up tied so tightly to an unfeeling, unsleeping device? Maybe it's worth tracing. A mainstream historical fact: the development of mechanical clocks was not originally intended for spiritual betterment. It emerged from a growing intellectual obsession with order. Medieval Europe saw a wave of scholars, particularly in cathedral schools and monasteries, who sought to map and master the natural world, not through prayer alone, but through measurement. The monks weren't just praying anymore. They were calculating. You think of Brother Oswin, again, with his blackened fingertips and gear diagrams scribbled in the margins of St. Augustine. He's not an inventor in the modern sense, he's a devotee. And his god is time. But it wasn't always gears. You remember something you overheard as a novice, an old tale about the monastery's pre-clock years, when the timing of prayers relied on an ancient astrolabe mounted in the garden. It tracked stars, not seconds. A beautiful, brass disc with elegant inscriptions. The kind of thing that invited awe, not anxiety. It was stolen, apparently, in the 1290s. Or melted down to make hinges. No one really knows. One fringe tidbit. In a monastery in England, the clock's keeper was known as the Time Angel, not just a poetic title, but a literal position in the abbey hierarchy. He wore a small embroidered sun on his sleeve and wasn't allowed to speak more than 3 words during morning duties. It was said he embodied both the burden and the blessing of measured time. You imagine yourself as the Time Angel, pacing the cloisters at dawn, arms folded behind your back, measuring not with seconds, but with steps, with sunbeams, with breath. Historians still argue whether mechanical time desacralized the monastic day. Some suggest it simply gave structure to divine chaos. Others claim it was the first breach in a long spiritual unraveling, one that would eventually lead to punch clocks and fluorescent lights and phone alarms with names like meeting, strategy sync. You shift under your blanket. The ticking feels louder now. Maybe it's the wood expanding in the cold. Maybe it's in your own head. You press your fingers to your temple, then your chest. You try to feel your own time instead. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, breathe out. 1, 2, 3, the body has its own metronome. Softer. Gentler. But no less real, and maybe that's what the monks feared when the clock arrived, not the noise, not the schedule, but the fact that it introduced an alternative center. No longer was time housed in flesh, in breath, in faith. It was housed in brass. Even now, centuries later, you wonder, is your day still shaped by prayer? Or by the thing that tells you when to pray? The candle at your bedside has long since died. The wax is a tiny puddle, cold to the touch. You curl deeper into the blanket and pull it over your ear, trying to shut out the ticking, but the clock is patient. It doesn't mind if you ignore it. It will still be there. Still moving. Still marking. You wonder if time is something we invented to control our lives. Or if it invented us to witness its passing. You blink, and for a moment, you swear you hear a second rhythm, your heartbeat, still yours. Still separate, a quiet defiance. Sleep, when it comes again, comes softly. You drift toward it, not pushed by the clock's demands, but drawn inward, toward something older, slower, unmeasured. Tick, even the machine sounds like it's whispering now. The bell for matins comes like a crack through velvet. It isn't loud, exactly, but at this hour, when the world has barely begun to shift in its sleep, it feels like thunder. You wake with a jolt, limbs tangled in your blanket, mouth dry and eyes refusing to open more than a sliver. Outside your cell, the familiar rustle begins, sandals on stone, robes brushing doorframes, someone coughing into their sleeve. It's not yet dawn. Not even close. The sky outside your narrow window is still thick with stars. This is the part of the day, if you can call it that monks dislike the most, the pre-dawn vigil, when the mind is fogged and the cold bites, and yet you're expected to rise and praise the Lord with clear voice and steady rhythm. And once again, it is the clock that ensures no one slips past it unnoticed. You shuffle into the chapel half asleep, like a ghost herded by iron gears. The bell has stopped, but the echo lingers in your bones. You take your place in the choir stall and bow your head, the chant begins. Low. Barely a whisper. The Latin syllables string together like beads on a thread. You mouth them automatically, Domini, labia mea aperis. And then, just like that, the words begin to carry you. A mainstream historical fact, Matins was the longest and most elaborate of the canonical hours, often taking up to 2 hours to complete in medieval monastic tradition. Designed as a kind of spiritual offering in the stillness of night. It combined psalms, readings, hymns, and silence, meant to lift the soul while the rest of the world slept. You glance sideways and see Brother Godric, eyes fully closed, chin wobbling as he tries not to nod off. Across from him, the young novice, barely 14, is mouthing the words with the exaggerated care of someone still afraid of Latin. You smile, but just faintly. Even the smile feels tired. The candlelight shimmers across the stone floor like a pool of warm gold. You let your eyes blur. Time, here, seems to soften. At least for a moment, but only for a moment. Tick, the sound returns. From above. The mechanical clock chimes softly, not loud enough to interrupt, but just enough to remind. Always reminding. You are on its schedule now. One fringe tidbit: some monasteries with advanced clocks eventually installed multiple chime settings, so they could have a soft bell for night services and a louder strike for daytime hours. One record mentions a bell affectionately known as Dormitorium's nudge, a tone so gentle it could wake a monk without making him hate God. Yours, sadly, is not such a bell. You chant. You listen. You kneel. You stand. You chant again. There's a rhythm to this ritual, an ancient flow passed down through centuries. And for a while, the presence of the clock fades into the background. You lose yourself in the music, in the candlelight, in the warmth of shared breath and whispered devotion, but just before the final psalm ends, the bell strikes again, 3 low tones. Sharp. Mechanical. Irreversible. It's time, time to close the books. Time to extinguish the candles. Time to go. Historians still argue whether the introduction of the clock into monastic prayer life enhanced the spirituality of the daily cycle or imposed a kind of liturgical tyranny. Some scholars argue that precise timing allowed for deeper discipline and harmony. Others say it turned devotion into duty, worship into work. You rise with the others and file out into the cold corridor. Your breath ghosts in the air. It's still night, technically, but the world is beginning to stir. You step outside. The sky is a soft navy now, a few stars still clinging on. The eastern horizon hints at silver. You take a long breath. And for the first time in hours, you hear no bell, no ticking. Just birdsong, tentative and sleepy, and the wind rustling the ivy on the walls. For a heartbeat, it feels like old time again, not measured. Not controlled, just present. You turn and look back at the bell tower. Its shape is a silhouette against the sky, unmoving and watchful. Inside, the gears are already shifting, preparing for the next chime, but for now, you walk slowly back to your cell, cradling this quiet moment like a warm cup. The day has begun, whether you're ready or not. The sun has finally risen, but it doesn't burst over the horizon like some triumphant banner. It leaks in gently, through narrow stained glass windows and cracks in the shutters, casting soft light on the ancient stones of the monastery. You sit in the garden now, after lauds and a hasty breakfast of coarse bread and barely warmed broth, watching the way the light shifts over the dewy cabbage patches. Somewhere above you, the clock ticks unseen, as if supervising even this, your brief moment of stillness among the vegetables. Brother Anselm kneels nearby, whispering to a worm he's accidentally disturbed while hoeing the lettuce beds. You assume it's a prayer. It could be an apology. Or both. It's work hour now, and while the labor is hard, there's comfort in the repetition. Weeding. Pruning. Gathering herbs. The rhythm of your hands is your own, even if the clock will tell you precisely when to stop. You savor that illusion of control while you can. A mainstream historical fact: many monasteries adopted mechanical clocks not just to regulate prayer, but also to maximize labor efficiency. Benedictine rules demanded a careful balance between ora, prayer, and labora, work. The clock allowed abbots to schedule down to the half-hour, ensuring no prayer lasted too long, and no monk slacked off in the cabbage field. At first glance, it seems reasonable. Efficient. Even fair, but you can feel the shift in your own bones, the difference between working until a task feels complete versus stopping mid-row because the bell says you must move on. There's something about being interrupted by a machine that stings deeper than when a human calls your name. The wind tugs at your hood. Birds chirp unseen in the upper trees. Somewhere behind the apothecary wall, Brother Matthew is chanting softly to his rosemary cuttings again. He claims they grow straighter that way. No one has the heart to disagree. The bell rings. It's time for a short reading and then preparation for terce, the third prayer of the day. You gather your tools, brush the dirt from your fingers, and rise. As you walk back, Brother Oswin intercepts you in the cloister. He has ink on his nose again. I think, he says in a grave whisper, the escapement is slipping. You nod solemnly. You have no idea what that means, he continues. If the weights unspool too quickly, the noon chime will hit at sext. You realize what that means. You blink. Double lentil duty? No. He leans closer. The bell before the bell. Unnatural. You pat his shoulder and promise to check the tower after prayers. Not that you know how. But it's better than seeing him unravel entirely. One fringe tidbit: some monks developed personal systems for resisting the clock's domination. A few reportedly carried pebbles, smooth stones used to measure time in private rituals. One pebble dropped into a bowl every psalm. A kind of silent protest. A return to time is felt rather than enforced. You've never seen anyone do it, but you've noticed the faint clink from Brother Theobald's cell during Vespers. You suspect he has a whole bowl under his bed. Historians still argue whether monks truly adapted to mechanical time or merely endured it. There's evidence in letters, margins, even graffiti, jokes about iron bells, complaints about clock headaches, and one memorable drawing of a monk kicking a gear wheel into a pond. These small signs suggest the relationship wasn't one of awe, but of negotiation, and here, in this late morning sliver of the day, you feel that too. You enter the scriptorium and take your seat at the long table. The parchment is dry. The ink smells like walnut and vinegar. You dip your quill and begin, but in the back of your mind, you hear it tick. The silence between the ticks is worse, somehow, filled with the weight of what's coming next. When will it ring? Will it be on time? Will it break again? Will Oswin panic and attempt another midnight repair involving candle wax and prayer? You let your quill trail off into a flourish. You close your eyes, just for a second. You imagine the monastery before the machine. The bells rung by hand. The timing determined by light, temperature, mood, grace. You picture the sacristan standing in the garden, shading his eyes, then calmly ringing a bell rope with one hand while eating a plum with the other. It's a nice image, but it's gone now, replaced with precision. With iron. With accountability. You straighten your back, finish the line you were writing, something about Saint Martin and a goose, and check the shadow on the floor. Not long now. Terce is approaching. You sigh and whisper, clock willing. Terce comes and goes like a breeze through an open chapel door, brief, structured, and vaguely refreshing if you don't think about how soon sext is coming behind it. The prayers are short. The voices, a bit stronger now in the later morning light. Even the ticking from above seems quieter, or perhaps you're simply tuning it out better. You return to your tasks for the day, this time not the gardens, but the library. It's your favorite post. Despite the dust, books are rare and precious here, not for their beauty, though some are lavishly illuminated, but because they are trusted companions, objects that do not chime, do not tick, do not measure. They simply are. Today's assignment: copying a weathered manuscript detailing local medicinal herbs. You settle in at your desk, carefully laying out your tools: quill, ink, blotting sand, and a tiny spoon carved from bone to mix the red pigment used for headings. As you begin copying the first lines, you sink into the pace of it, slow, deliberate, curved letters forming like the unfurling of a fern. Here, you are in control. Not the clock. Not completely, at least, but then, the door creaks. Brother Alcuin enters, holding a small slate in both hands like it's a wounded animal. It's early, he whispers, pale and accusatory. You look up, confused. The noon bell, he adds. It rang 8 minutes ago. You glance at the high window, where the light is golden, not quite overhead. You sigh, Oswin's escapement, you mutter, a mainstream historical fact. Early mechanical clocks were notoriously inaccurate by modern standards. Even the best of them might drift by 10 or 15 minutes each day. Monks had to perform frequent manual corrections, often using sundials or observing shadows, thus blending high-tech innovation with low-tech intuition. You rise, setting your quill down, and join Alcuin outside. A few others have gathered, murmuring and pointing toward the tower. One monk is holding a small portable sundial like he's about to duel someone with it. The abbot appears, his brows knit in concern, but not surprise. This isn't the first time, you, somehow, are roped into assisting Oswin again. Not because you're mechanically inclined, but because you have small hands and a relatively patient soul. Inside the clock tower, the air smells of rust and old beeswax. You climb the tight wooden steps, gears creaking overhead. Oswin is already muttering, hands deep in the belly of the beast. Escapement arm got caught, he says. Again. You nod as if you understand. He gestures for you to hand him the long iron crank. One fringe tidbit: there were recorded cases of monks treating clock maintenance like a religious rite, fasting before major repairs, lighting candles in front of the gearworks, even reciting psalms while oiling the chains. Some clocks were given names, and a few were blessed with holy water. Your monastery's clock is called Regina Temporum, Queen of Time. She is rarely affectionate. As Oswin adjusts the chain weight, you watch the huge wooden wheel spin, catching teeth like a dragon chewing slowly. The hammer that strikes the bell above your head is blackened from soot and time. You wonder if it ever wanted this job. Historians still argue whether medieval monks saw these clocks as tools, companions, or tyrants. Some writings describe the devices as sacred gifts, others as soulless burdens. In one preserved letter from a Carthusian prior, the clock is described as a blessing wrapped in iron teeth. You descend the tower just as the correction chime rings out, louder than usual, like it knows it's late and is trying to sound extra authoritative. The monks gathered below offer small nods and go back to their tasks. Crisis averted. Time, once again, has been corrected. But something lingers in your chest. You return to the library and resume copying, though your hand is slightly less steady. It's hard to focus when you've just wrestled with a mechanical beast that can shift the whole monastery by 15 minutes in either direction. Later, during sext, you watch the sunlight pass across the chapel floor, perfectly aligned with the window at exactly the moment of the second psalm. The clock may drift, but the sun still knows what it's doing, and you start to wonder, did the monks invent the clock to control time, or to protect themselves from it, to pin it down, to tame it, to convince themselves that time was something that could be counted instead of felt? But here in this chapel, as the incense curls up like a spiral of ancient dreams, you feel the truth. Time was never tamed, it was only scheduled. Afternoon fades gently, like parchment yellowing under a soft sun. You walk along the cloister garden after none, the mid-afternoon prayer, listening to the breeze rustling through rosemary and thyme. The sun warms your shoulders as you pass beneath a colonnade of carved stone saints who, mercifully, don't keep time. You're tired, but not in a way that sleep would fix. It's a timed tiredness. A kind of fatigue that comes not from labor alone, but from being nudged by bells from moment to moment, never too early, never quite late, never allowed to drift. You pause beneath the fig tree that never seems to fruit. Someone's placed a smooth stone on its lowest branch. Probably Brother Theobald again. With his pebble timing. A quiet rebellion against a loud machine. The mechanical bell doesn't ring now, it won't again until Vespers, but you feel it ticking above you, marking the seconds invisibly. Even the silence carries its shape, a mainstream historical fact. The shift from natural to mechanical timekeeping had cognitive effects. Scholars believe it altered how people understood the flow of their days. Before clocks, daily life was organized by task-based time, when the bread is baked, after the sun hits the west wall. With mechanical clocks, the day became partitioned, more abstract, more precise, more outside oneself. You didn't used to need a bell to know when to stop copying a manuscript. You could feel it in your wrist. You could see the change in light. You could sense when the day turned. Now, you wait for the chime. You walk slowly to the cloister's far end, where Brother Oswin is sketching a gear system in chalk on the wall. The abbot will not be pleased. Oswin looks up and grins, completely unapologetic. It's for a night silencer, he says. Dampens the chime after Compline. Won't that defeat the purpose? You ask, he shrugs. It might let someone sleep. You almost tell him to stop, that the system works well enough already. But something in you rebels. So you nod, and sit beside him, watching as he marks out another arc, a fringe tidbit. Some monasteries intentionally muffled their clocks during certain seasons, especially Lent or Advent, claiming it fostered a deeper contemplative silence. One monk, writing in the 15th century, even suggested that the absence of the bell is a bell itself. You wonder what it would feel like to live a whole week with no bell. To wake when the birds do. To pray when your breath slows. To eat when the soup smells right. Historians still argue whether mechanical clocks improved spiritual focus or fractured it. Some say the predictability enhanced monastic discipline. Others claim it introduced spiritual compartmentalization, faith reduced to 20-minute windows, closing like shutters as the bell tolls. You and Oswin sit in the garden until the sun tilts noticeably westward. Neither of you speak. The chalk drawings fade slightly in the heat, then, almost reluctantly, you stand. It's nearly Vespers, the idea of skipping it flits through your mind, just for a moment. But of course, you won't. The clock will ring whether you're there or not. And besides, there's something beautiful about the harmonies of dusk. Something even the gears haven't ruined. You return to the chapel, sliding into your usual seat as the first note of the chant begins. The sound is soft, like a door creaking open at twilight, and for a few moments, the clock feels far away, because here, inside this swell of voices and warm candlelight, you remember the purpose of it all. The rhythm wasn't invented by monks or machines. It was already there, in the heartbeat, in the sun, in the cycle of prayer that predates every escapement and wait. The clock was just a translation, a stiff, noisy, imperfect translation of something we were already trying to hold. You bow your head, you listen. The chant wraps around you like twilight linen. And above, somewhere hidden behind beams and bells, Regina Temporum ticks on. Faithfully. For now. Night has returned. Not with drama, but with the slow certainty of a candle burning down. After Vespers, you pass quietly through the cloister, your sandals brushing the warm stones. Supper was simple, lentils, again, and the final light has all but slipped from the sky. Now comes Compline once more, the day's soft punctuation mark. It's funny. You spent the entire day wrapped in bells and time, and yet it still surprises you that it's already night. How does that happen, when every hour is marked with such insistence? You step into the chapel and breathe deep. The air smells of wax and wood polish and the faint scent of herbs tucked into robes. The kind of scent that never changes. You settle into your place, eyes closing, spine straight. The candlelight flickers against the choir stalls. The chanting begins again, and just like last night, the words arrive not with effort, but with ease. They live in your mouth now. They are your breath, a mainstream historical fact. By the 15th century, some clocks in larger monasteries could even ring automated sequences of different bells, changing tones depending on which service was being summoned. These were called jackmarts, automaton figures that struck bells with little mechanical arms, like puppet sacristans. One abbey even built a mechanical monk that bowed after every toll. Yours doesn't have that, yet. Though if Oswin had his way, you'd soon have a robotic choir director who threw a tiny book at anyone who missed their cue. Compline ends without fanfare. No final chant. Just a soft, collective breath as you and your brothers rise and file out again. Silence begins now. True silence. Not just quietness, but the intentional absence of words. The rule says, let there be silence, and let the monks hold to it with all their heart. So you do, you return to your cell. You don't light the candle. The moon is enough. The air is cooler now, and your blanket feels heavier, in a good way. Like protection. You lie on your back, eyes open, staring up at the low ceiling beams. They're etched with old scratches from when this place was younger. Older monks. Longer nights, tick, the sound is back, soft and even, but it doesn't feel hostile anymore. You think of Regina Temporum, your reluctant queen. Tireless. Dutiful. Yes, annoying. But loyal, in her way. You think of all the days she's counted, the prayers she's called, the storms she's ticked through. A fringe tidbit, in one isolated abbey, when the great clock finally broke beyond repair, the monks held a funeral. They placed the cracked main gear on a velvet cloth, processed through the cloister with lit candles, and buried it beneath a fig tree. The inscription read, "She kept us faithful." Even when we hated her, you close your eyes and imagine doing the same. Carrying your clock's final piece to the edge of the garden. Not with bitterness. But with respect. Historians still argue whether monks ever truly loved their clocks. Some claim the relationship was always fraught. Others believe it was a kind of arranged marriage, inconvenient at first, but, over time, mutual in its strange devotion. You smile, because in your case, it's both. The ticking continues. But your body doesn't tense like it once did. Instead, it matches pace. Breath for tick. Inhale. Exhale, you no longer need to know the hour. You already feel it. The night doesn't need numbers to be sacred, the day is over. And even though the clock says otherwise, you know, deeply, gently, that rest has begun. The candle has long since gone out. The stars are steady in the sky now, not racing, just resting where they've always been. And you. You're almost there too. Let your eyes close fully, if they haven't already. Feel the stillness of your little cell. The way the walls hold the warmth of the day just enough to keep out the chill. The way the rough wool of your blanket presses gently on your chest. Protective. Familiar, beyond your window, the monastery sleeps. The gardens are quiet. The fig tree rustles only when the wind remembers it. Even the bell, for now, has no reason to ring, but the clock still ticks. Not loudly. Not demandingly. Just. Steadily, it no longer nags at you. It no longer feels like a leash. It is simply part of the room, like the beams or the bricks or the quiet beat of your heart, and now you know, it was never really about the hours, or the bells, or the gears. It was about rhythm, about making space, about choosing to mark each moment, not with urgency, but with attention. So sleep now, sleep the way monks did when the ticking became part of their breath. Let your thoughts settle like dust in a quiet cloister. Let your body rest into the old rhythm. The real rhythm. The one beneath the bells, the one that says, you've done enough for today, you are exactly where you need to be, and time will keep without you for a little while. Good night.